Please stand and sing from the blue hymnal, hymn 508. You may be seated. Welcome to Calvary Episcopal Church's Lenten preaching series in its 101st year in this new century of preaching. I'm Catherine Bush, Associate Rector for Formation here in this place, and we are so glad to be here in person and know that many more folks are joining us online. Welcome, however you're with us. As we settle in for a beautiful shared moment of inspiration, allow me to offer a few reminders. Please take a moment to silence your cell phone or anything else that you might have with you that would distract you or draw those around you away from our time here. I'll give you a moment to wait while you check. If you're sticking around for lunch in the waffle shop downstairs, we know you'll find good food, great conversation, and on the way there in the Great Hall, this room immediately to our south, you'll find some community partners. Thistle and Bee and the Episcopal Bookshop are here offering books and gifts that give back. And if you're sticking around through tomorrow, come back because for sure you're not going to want to miss Peggy Jean Craig. It'll be a good one, and Friday also means fish pudding. Take that as an invitation or not. Back to today. We are thrilled and honored to welcome Cole Arthur Riley to Calvary and to Memphis. She is here, embodied in this room, though you may have encountered her virtually through the mystical space that she has carved out on Instagram. If you're not already following Black Liturgies, it's a haven and a respite in the middle of streams of input, creating actual liturgical space in the swirl. Cole curates Black wisdom, poetry, and breath practice to ground and center all of us who are starved for these very things. Last night, Cole and Jackie Lewis gave us the gift of listening in on their conversation, and if you missed it, you didn't really. You can go find it on Calvary's podcast, and I encourage you to seek out that wisdom as well. Before our reading and her offering today, we will center ourselves by singing once more. A reading from Psalm 42. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. Here ends the reading.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me in this space and for being in this space together. We're going to think about the silence of God today and how belief and doubt can serve as complicated but necessary companions on our... I'll spare you all and wait a second. We're going to talk about silence, the silence of God, and how belief and doubt can serve as a complicated and necessary companion on our Lenten journey. The text I've chosen is a poem by a poet named Vivi Francis. It's called Like Jesus to the Crows that gathered there along his arms, upon the invitation of a slender limb, and not oblivious to human violence, perhaps needed rest or needed to offer the shelter of presence, despite the stiff collar of their feathers, despite each one being the children of a father who claimed an upper realm. It is not true they pecked his eyes, nor did they consider his wounds their own. They were neither irreverent nor quiet. They spoke in the tongues they knew. They cawed full-voiced and would have released him from his bindings had their beaks held the power and had there been time in that place. Like them, I have sought to comfort and so be comforted. Like them, I've seen the failure of miracles when they were most needed. Like him, I have called upon those so unlike myself when my father failed to answer. This poem for me is an artifact of both belief and doubt. Two questions for me are kind of suspended in the tension. The first, how can we possibly retain imagination for a God who is silent? And the second, how is belief transfigured in the wake of divine silence? How is belief transfigured and transformed in the wake of divine silence? So I'm 5 or 6 years old, and my father has taken me and my sister out to breakfast at Denny's. We box up our meal to go along with my mostly untouched glass of milk. And the waitress, pours it into one of those to-go cups, the plastic opaque ones with, the lids and the flexi straws and the cartoons on the outside, mazes. And as Arthur family lore goes, when we get into the car, 6-year-old Cole begins a very long interrogation of the cup's contents. So I'm asking my dad, how do I know it's milk? And he's saying, because I'm telling you it's milk. And I say, but I can't see that it's milk, because I'm inspecting the, opaque vessel. And he's going, Nicole, I'm telling you it's milk. And I said, but how do you know it's milk? And so he, takes off the lid and lets me see inside the liquid. It's white, it looks like milk. And I say, it could be something else white. And so this went on for longer than what I'm sure my 24-year-old single father had the energy for, until eventually he gives the cup to my sister, and we let her drink it. She's 2 years older than me. And I just sit there watching with a little bit of regret, a little bit of jealousy maybe. So when my family tells me I was born a skeptic, I don't argue, okay? Now, you might be wondering how it came to be that a 6-year-old Cole could lack such trust in the world, how the world presented itself. And, I'm afraid I learned, like many other children, too early that people aren't precisely who they appear to be. And how much of my skepticism was truly inherent and how much was the result of trauma, I don't think I'll ever know. But I admire my father's patience with my unbelief in the car, his attempts to move me toward trust without forcing me to drink, And I think perhaps he knew that my leeriness would someday protect me, and that sometimes distrust of the world means you're learning to trust yourself. So Octavia Butler wrote a novel called The Parable of the Sower. I don't know how many of you have read. I see some nods, so that's good. In it, it tells the story of a 15-year-old, she ages throughout the novel, but a 15-year-old black girl named Lauren on the edge of apocalypse. The world as we know it has ended, and the earth has been destroyed. The land is no longer viable. Poor people are kind of left to suffer and starve and burn. And the slightly privileged have erected these walled neighborhoods, these kind of pockets of safety, partial safety, as the world kind of burns around them. And Lauren belongs in one of these walled neighborhoods. And in the midst of it, she has the self-trust to name her own God. Her father is a pastor in a, more traditional Christian context. And she recognizes that the religion of her father is not for her. She understands how it's been complicit in the end of her world, the degradation of land, the walled neighborhoods, that are keeping the poor out. And she feels that she can no longer approach that kind of religion with self-honesty. And so she begins to make up her own religion. She writes, "My God has another name," and goes on to kind of realize this new form for the divine in her life. Now, you would not be alone if the thought of a child making up their own religion stirs some tension in you. I think that is by design. I think that was Butler's intention, to make us feel uncomfortable with it. But there is, even in the terror of it, there is something beautiful about a child possessing the courage to make meaning out of profound devastation. That instead of relinquishing her connection to the divine, that she would seek a God of more mystery and healing than she had been given access to, that she would make her own cup to drink from. Now, much of my skepticism is born of an unhealthy distrust, but maybe some of it is also born of wisdom, and maybe some of yours is too. Often, when we demand that someone profess certainty, when we demand someone be sure of God, it's because we ourselves are terrified to confront our own unbelief, and we experience their interior honesty as a threat to our mask, really. And I'll say this, religious certainty specifically is a really effective tool of white supremacy. I think that's its origin. Any tyrant survives by a lack of questioning, survives by atrophying the people's capacity to question for themselves, to refuse a narrative that's handed to them. Oppression survives by people who act and believe, or at least say they believe, without challenging the narrative, without challenging those in power. And so part of my skepticism, I think, stands in defiance to this and in allegiance with my own intuition. And that can be a beautiful thing. I hope you hear that's true of yourself as well. And still, doubt is not without pain. So I don't want to romanticize it. I have a tendency to do this. But those of us who know what it is to pray to a God you don't believe exists know this pain too well. I wasn't raised in the church. I wasn't raised with a particular set of religious beliefs or creeds. And by the time I began attending church in college, I was interested in God, but in a philosophical sense, not in a relational one. And so, I was quite surprised to encounter people who spoke about talking to God as if it was no less strenuous than picking up the phone and catching up with an old friend. I didn't understand it. It was very mysterious to me, and it felt as if I could not access that, whatever they had. And my skepticism was a kind of alienation, and my doubts, I think, a site of shame. I've never heard the voice of God. I've never even sensed it. And trust doesn't come easy to me. I've always been made of more doubt than certainty. Mostly, one learns to accept this. Some of you are kind of nodding, you know the feeling. Mostly one learns to accept this fact. One learns to perform belief, even on days when it is impossible to truly muster. But there are days, there are seasons even, when uncertainty feels closer to a curse, and the silence of God feels cruel. Feels really cruel in comparison to those who appear to have this access. Last week, I watched a little boy from my phone. I watched a little boy scraping spilled flour from the rubble in Gaza with his bare hands. And I watched him stuffing it in his pocket, with dirt and twigs mixed into the flour. In the past 5 months, over 30,000 people have been murdered in Gaza. More children were killed in the first 3 weeks than all of the world's conflict zones combined since 2019. In 3 weeks, we've seen fathers carry their children in pieces. Pieces. There are days when the silence of God feels unfathomably cruel. The psalmist, from the passage we began with, is of course no stranger to this. If you heard that refrain, "Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me?" And there's a line of, my foes taunt me all day long, saying, "Where is your God? Where is your God?" Lent, at its most honest, I think, must contend with this. In Lent, not only do we confront the suffering of the world, not only do we confront how we ourselves contribute to the suffering of the world, the blood on our hands, but we confront a God who, in mystery, offers us no resolution not in Lent. We are left to wait in the silence. The poem I've read to you, it occurs at the site of the cross. I don't know how obvious that is when you're hearing it for the first time, but that poem, it's happening on the cross while Christ is hanging there, like Jesus to the crows that gathered there along his arms while he was hanging on the cross. And there's a line, like him, I've called upon those so unlike myself when my Father failed to answer, which is, of course, the poet's nod to Christ's most haunting words in Scripture, my God, why have you forsaken me? The poem, among other things, I take as an accusation of divine silence and a question of what it means to encounter the terrors of this world, the grief, the trauma, the deception, and be met by the silence of God. There's real pain there. Now, here's the thing. I know silence. So when I was little, I wasn't very verbal. I used to carry around a notepad and pen and pass notes to my father and sister when there were other people around. I wouldn't speak. I had something called selective mutism, which is an anxiety condition. And because of this, I had multiple speech impediments. So even as I became more comfortable speaking, I still remained an incredibly quiet child. And to this day, silence has been a harbor at times. So my question for myself this Lent is, how can we complicate the silence of God in our interpretations of it? Okay, I've just talked about the doom and kind of departure of silence, but how can we complicate the silence of God in our interpretations of it? I'll tell you a story about sound to do this. Okay, in the middle of lockdown, my husband and I bought a speaker system. We were watching a lot of movies like the rest of the world. We wanted to feel something, do something. So we bought this speaker system. But I myself am very sensitive to sound. I always have been. And in the pandemic, that's only heightened. And the sound system, there's a kind of disproportionate effect of volume between the dialogue and like the sound effects and the background noise. I don't know if you all are plagued by this, where the dialogue will sound normal and then all of a sudden a crash or a clap or the background music, and it's, my heart thumping. So my husband would have to watch with his finger always hovering over the volume button to prepare to turn it down at a moment's notice, and inevitably he'd miss the notice, and I'd end up getting irrationally irritated, face flushed, heart racing, and it all felt like a betrayal. And when I told my therapist about our speakers and how I secretly poured a glass of gin over them so I would stop yelling at my husband, she told me that noise sensitivity is a trauma response. It took years for me to understand that silence, which I had long mistaken for abandonment, might actually be a mercy in a world whose noise will not relent. The world is loud. For better and worse, we have more access than ever before to every kind of opinion, knowledge, endless stimulation. Silence is a subversive act. I think it takes courage to pause and withhold voice, to listen. It's deeply formative. And in Lent, we confront the silence of God. I think we can do that without apology, as the psalmist does. And we can so too recognize the silence of God as not necessarily dislocation, but presence. Presence to self, presence to the divine. There's a stanza from Christian Wyman, who's a poet. It shares a phrase with the book that it comes from called My my bright abyss. And he says, my God, my bright abyss, into which all my longing will not go. Once more I come to the end of all I know, and believing nothing, believe in this. And it ends with a colon. That's it. That's the whole that's the whole thing. It ends with a colon. This wait, and believing nothing, believe in this. And he's getting at this void, this void of or this lack of precision that he encounters with God, and that's still a form of encounter. A God of the abyss. I don't know what I believe most days, and God feels like more a void than a voice. But is there beauty in that too? I think of the kind of classic Zora Neale Hurston line, they seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God. They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes are watching God. I no longer demand belief where there's tension. And I think if the divine is all-knowing, I can only suspect they understand and have great sympathy for why I find it difficult to believe in a God who's loving or kind or listening in a world of so much sorrow and injustice. Our doubts are credible, and our disbelief human, and I see no need to force one another to resolve them under this false promise of salvation or nearness to God. God is opaque to me, dark, black, silent. And maybe the answers to my doubts is not to conquer them. Maybe it's not a pursuit of clarity, but mystery. The unknowability of the divine, I think, is a kind of liberation. I want to end with this point because I think it's important to say the poem itself that we read, it's not silent. It's not a poem of total silence. I think there's a case to be made that the truer subject of the poem is actually not God, but the crows that are gathered. It says they were neither quiet nor irreverent. They spoke in the tongues they knew. They cawed full-voiced and would have released him from his bindings had their beaks held the power and had there been time in that place. What do you hear in the silence? I think you will be surprised to find just how a different voice can come into focus when a room has the courage to quiet. Whose voice, whose silence, and what does divine silence allow us to hear? I think too often we wait around pining for our idea of God to come rescue us and make themselves real to us. But as June Jordan says, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Towards the end of the poem, like them I have sought to comfort and so be comforted. The sacred mutuality. I was desperate to be comforted by God. I am to some extent. And I fail to recognize that the presence that I seek can be found in the crows, can be found in the grass, in the face of my neighbor. A bit earlier in the poem, you have this beautiful line, about the crows not being oblivious to human violence. They are a witness, and they stay present to the suffering of Christ, and in the absence of God's voice, in a moment which has been translated as the, sheer abandonment of God. The poet is reminding us we have company. Unlikely company. The poet recasts our imagination for the sight of the cross, and I think the sight of our own suffering as a potential to unlikely connection. Even that connection which is not the form of the divine that we demanded. Every commitment to witness, every vow of presence that we make with each other will help us resist despair, will help us resist the silence. Can you meet the face of God in the tears of the suffering? Maybe you won't hear God's voice, see their face, but can you meet the face of God in your neighbor? Can you bear witness with the same gravity that you demand God to witness you? I think this is our Lenten journey. Silence and sound, absence and presence. I'll close by reading our poem one more time if you want to receive it together. Like Jesus to the crows that gathered there along his arms, upon the invitation of a slender limb, and not oblivious to human violence, perhaps needed rest or needed to offer the shelter of presence, despite the stiff collar of their feathers, despite each one being no less the children of a father who claimed an upper realm. It is not true they pecked his eyes, nor did they consider his wounds their own. They were neither irreverent nor quiet. They spoke in the tongues they knew. They cawed full-voiced and would have released him from his bindings had their beaks held the power and had there been time in that place. Like them, I have sought to comfort and so be comforted. Like them, I have seen the failure of miracles when they were most needed. Like him, I have called upon those so unlike myself when my Father failed to answer. I've never heard the voice of God. I've never felt them calling out to me in the pits of despair, but I know my grandma's voice. I know that trees die and come back to life again, and it's beautiful, and the right sunset can steady my breath. I know that my sister will answer when I call, and that she'll always take the first sip when I don't trust the milk. I know my name and the sound of my Father's voice saying my name, speaking it. And maybe this is what belief will always look like for me. Can that be okay? My God has another name. Let your souls receive this rest. The divine who is both silence and void, visible and invisible, near and far, small and grand, has mercy on you. Allow them now to liberate you from the bondage of certainty, that you would walk freely in a different kind of presence, a defiant imagination, and a sacred unknowing. Amen.
Please stand. If you would like to offer a brief greeting to Cole, she'll be here at the steps as we dismiss. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God.